The mountain peaks of Colorado Territory stretched endlessly against the pale winter sky, their snow-capped summits catching the first light of dawn like ancient sentinels guarding secrets older than memory itself. In the valley below, where the pine trees grew thick and the streams ran clear and cold, stood a cabin that had weathered 15 winters, its log walls chinked tight against the bitter winds that swept down from the high country. This was the domain of Jacob McKinnon, a man whose hands were as rough as the bark of the ponderosa pines, and whose heart had grown as solitary as the peaks he called home. Jacob had come to these mountains as a young man of 22, fleeing the crowded streets of Boston and the expectations of a father who wanted him to follow in the family banking business. The call of the wilderness had been stronger than blood, stronger than duty, and he had answered it with the fervor of a man seeking salvation in the untamed places of the earth. Now, at 37, he was as much a part of these mountains as the granite cliffs and the eagles that soared between them. His days followed the rhythm of the seasons, with the precision of a well-wound clock. In spring, he trapped beaver and marten along the rushing streams, their pelts thick and valuable after the long winter. Summer brought the task of cutting and splitting wood for the cold months ahead, while autumn meant hunting elk and deer to fill his smokehouse with meat that would sustain him through the snows. Winter was for mending traps, reading the few books he owned by lamplight, and enduring the profound silence that settled over the land like a blanket of stars. But as the years passed, the silence had begun to weigh on him differently. Where once it had been a comfort, a refuge from the noise and complications of civilization, now it seemed to echo with something he could not name. He would catch himself talking to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Thunder, or addressing the chickens that pecked around his cabin as if they were old friends capable of meaningful conversation. The realization that he had not spoken to another human being in over 3 months struck him one morning with the force of an avalanche. It was then that he remembered the advertisement he had seen posted on the bulletin board outside Morrison's General Store during his last trip to town. The memory came back to him as clearly as if he were reading it again. Refined lady of good character seeks correspondence with gentlemen of means for the purpose of matrimony. Willing to relocate to suitable situation. References available upon request. Please respond to Miss Eleanor Whitmore, care of the Denver City Marriage Bureau. The idea had seemed absurd at the time. The notion of a mail-order bride, something that happened to other men. Desperate men who lacked the courage or ability to find wives through conventional means. But now, as he sat in his cabin listening to the wind moan through the eaves and watching the shadows of the flames dance on the walls, the idea began to take root in his mind, like a seed finding purchase in fertile soil. Please subscribe to our channel and let me know what city you're watching from. Jacob spent the next week composing his letter, writing and rewriting it until the words seemed right, until they captured something of who he was, without revealing too much of the loneliness that had driven him to this desperate measure. He described his cabin, his land, the life he had built in the mountains. He was honest about the isolation, about the harsh winters and the challenges of frontier life. But he also wrote about the beauty of the place, the way the sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose, the crystal clarity of the streams, the profound peace that could be found in the wilderness for those brave enough to seek it. When he finally rode into town to post the letter, His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to the postmaster. The die was cast, and there was no taking it back. He had committed himself to a course of action that would either bring companionship to his solitary existence or confirm his suspicion that he was destined to live and die alone in these mountains. The response came faster than he had dared to hope. Miss Eleanor Whitmore's letter was written in a delicate hand on paper that smelled faintly of lavender, and her words revealed an education and refinement that both impressed and intimidated him. She wrote of her life in Philadelphia, where she had worked as a governess for wealthy families after the death of her parents left her without means or prospects. She was 28 years old, she said, past the age when most women married, but still hopeful of finding a good man who would value her for her character rather than her youth or dowry. Their correspondence continued through the autumn and into the winter, letters traveling back and forth across the vast expanse of the continent, like migrating birds, carrying messages of hope and possibility. With each exchange, Jacob felt himself growing more attached to this woman he had never seen, this gentle soul who wrote of books and music and the simple pleasures of a well-tended garden. Eleanor, for her part, seemed genuinely interested in his life in the mountains, asking detailed questions about his daily routines, the wildlife he encountered, the changing of the seasons in the high country. As winter deepened and the snows piled high around his cabin, Jacob found himself counting the days until the next letter would arrive. He began to plan for Eleanor's arrival, imagining how he would expand the cabin to give her a proper bedroom, how he would build her the garden she wrote about with such longing, how her presence would transform his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful. It was in February, when the cold was at its most bitter and the snow lay 6 feet deep in the valleys, that Eleanor's letter arrived with the news that would change everything. She had accepted his proposal of marriage, she wrote, and would travel west as soon as the spring thaw made the journey possible. She asked only that he send money for her passage and that he meet her in Denver City, where they could be married before traveling to his mountain home. Jacob read the letter 3 times before the full import of her words sank in. She was cunning. This woman, who had become so real to him through her letters, so essential to his dreams of the future, was actually going to leave her comfortable life in the East and journey across a continent to marry a man she had never seen. The responsibility of it, the trust she was placing in him, was both exhilarating and terrifying. He spent the remaining weeks of winter in a frenzy of preparation. He expanded the cabin, adding a bedroom with a real window that looked out toward the peaks. He built furniture with his own hands, a dresser for her clothes. He even attempted to make curtains, though his efforts with needle and thread proved less successful than his work with hammer and saw. When the first green shoots of spring began to push through the melting snow, Jacob loaded his pack animals with the finest furs from his winter's trapping and set out for Denver City. The journey took him 3 days, following trails that were muddy and treacherous with snowmelt, but his heart was light with anticipation. In his saddlebags, he carried the money for Eleanor's passage and a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother, the only thing of value he had brought with him from his old life in Boston. Denver City in the spring of 1874 was a bustling frontier town, its streets thick with mud and crowded with prospectors, merchants, and settlers heading west in search of new opportunities. The marriage bureau was located in a modest building on Larimer Street. sandwiched between a saloon and a dry goods store. Jacob had never felt more out of place than he did walking through those streets in his buckskins and mountain boots, aware of the stares and whispers that followed in his wake. The clerk at the marriage bureau was a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed spectacles who looked at Jacob as if he were some exotic specimen that had wandered down from the high country. "Miss Whitmore?" he said, consulting his ledger. Yes, she arrived yesterday on the evening train. Quite punctual, I must say. She's staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Blake Street. Shall I send word that you've arrived?" Jacob nodded, suddenly tongue-tied at the prospect of finally meeting the woman who had occupied his thoughts for so many months. He had imagined this moment countless times during the long winter evenings. But now that it was upon him, he found himself paralyzed by uncertainty. What if she took one look at him and decided she had made a terrible mistake? What if the reality of frontier life proved too harsh for someone accustomed to the refinements of Eastern society? Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was a two-story frame building, painted white with green shutters. Its front porch decorated with flower boxes that would soon be bright with spring blooms. Jacob climbed the steps with the measured pace of a man walking to his own execution, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knocked on the door with knuckles that had suddenly gone numb, and waited for what seemed like an eternity before it opened to reveal a plump, motherly woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "You must be Mr. McKinnon," she said, her voice warm with welcome. "Miss Whitmore has been expecting you. She's in the parlor, poor dear. I think she's as nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. Come in, come in." Jacob followed her through a hallway decorated with faded wallpaper and family photographs, his boots loud on the polished wooden floors. The parlor was a cozy room with lace curtains and overstuffed furniture, a fire crackling cheerfully in the grate, despite the mildness of the spring day. And there, standing by the window with her back to the door, was Eleanor. She was smaller than he had imagined, more delicate, her dark hair pinned up in an elaborate style that spoke of hours spent before a mirror. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool that emphasized the slender curve of her waist. And when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, Jacob felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Eleanor Whitmore was beautiful in a way that took his breath away. But it was not the kind of beauty he had expected. Her letters had prepared him for intelligence and refinement, for kindness and good humor. But they had not prepared him for the ethereal quality of her features. The way the afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to gather around her like a benediction. Her eyes were the color of violets, large and expressive, framed by dark lashes that cast shadows on her pale cheeks. Her lips were full and soft, curved in a tentative smile that spoke of hope and uncertainty in equal measure. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the small parlor. Two strangers who had shared their deepest thoughts and dreams through letters, but had never heard each other's voices. Jacob tried to speak, to offer some word of greeting or welcome, but found that his throat had closed up entirely. The words he had rehearsed during the long ride from the mountains seemed to have fled from his mind like startled deer. "Mr. McKinnon?" Eleanor's voice was soft and musical, with just a trace of the refined accent he had imagined from her letters. I'm so pleased to finally meet you." Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but no sound emerged. He stood there like a statue, his hat clutched in his hands, staring at this vision of loveliness who had traveled across a continent to become his wife. The silence stretched between them, growing more awkward with each passing second, until Eleanor's smile began to falter, and a look of concern crossed her delicate features. "Are you quite well?" she asked, taking a small step toward him. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Still, Jacob could not find his voice. The shock of her beauty, the overwhelming reality of her presence after months of imagining this moment, had rendered him as mute as the mountains he called home. He could only nod helplessly, his face burning with embarrassment and something deeper, something that felt like awe. Mrs. Henderson, who had been hovering discreetly in the doorway, cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps you'd like some tea?" she suggested. "It's been a long journey for both of you, I'm sure." Eleanor nodded gratefully, though her eyes never left Jacob's face. "That would be lovely, thank you." She gestured toward a pair of chairs arranged near the fireplace. "Won't you sit down, Mr. McKinnon? We have so much to discuss." Jacob managed to move his feet, settling into the indicated chair with the awkward grace of a man unaccustomed to parlor furniture. Eleanor took the chair across from him, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance, and for several minutes they sat in silence, while Mrs. Henderson bustled about with tea things. The normalcy of the domestic scene seemed surreal to Jacob, who was still struggling to reconcile the flesh-and-blood woman before him with the correspondent who had become so dear to him through her letters. "I must confess," Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I had not expected, that is, your letters were so eloquent, so thoughtful, that I had imagined—" She trailed off, her cheeks coloring prettily. "Forgive me. I don't mean to suggest that you are not what I expected. It's simply that meeting someone in person after knowing them only through correspondence is rather overwhelming." Jacob nodded vigorously, grateful that she had put into words what he was feeling but could not express. He cleared his throat, trying once again to find his voice, but succeeded only in producing a strangled sound that made Eleanor's eyes widen with alarm. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we might postpone our conversation until tomorrow. The journey from Philadelphia was quite arduous, and I suspect you've traveled far to meet me. We're both tired, and perhaps a good night's rest will help us both feel more ourselves." Jacob nodded again, relief flooding through him at the reprieve. He rose from his chair with more haste than grace, nearly knocking over the small table beside it in his eagerness to escape the parlor and the overwhelming presence of this woman who had stolen his voice along with his breath. He managed a clumsy bow in Eleanor's direction before fleeing toward the door, leaving her staring after him with a mixture of confusion and concern. That night, Jacob lay awake in his room at the Denver House Hotel, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened to him. He had faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions, had survived blizzards that would have killed lesser men, had carved a life out of the wilderness with nothing but his own two hands and an iron will. Yet one look at Eleanor Whitmore had reduced him to a speechless fool, as tongue-tied as a schoolboy meeting his first sweetheart. He thought about her letters, the warmth and intelligence that had shone through every carefully crafted sentence. She was everything he had hoped for and more. But her beauty had been an unexpected gift that left him feeling unworthy and overwhelmed. How could a rough mountain man like himself hope to make such a refined lady happy? What did he have to offer her besides isolation and hardship? The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of spring in the air and the distant mountains visible through the hotel window, like a reminder of the life that waited for him beyond the confines of the city. Jacob dressed carefully in his best clothes, a suit of dark wool that he had purchased years ago for occasions that had never seemed to arise. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a stranger, a man trying to be something he was not. When he arrived at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, he found Eleanor waiting for him in the garden behind the building, a small patch of ground where early flowers were beginning to bloom. She wore a dress of pale green cotton that made her eyes look like spring leaves, and her hair was arranged more simply than it had been the day before, caught back with a ribbon that fluttered in the gentle breeze. "Good morning, Mr. McKinnon," she said, turning to greet him with a smile that seemed more confident than it had been the previous day. "I thought we might walk while we talk. I find that conversation flows more easily when one is moving." Jacob nodded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. Walking was something he understood, something that felt natural to his mountain-bred bones. They set out along the tree-lined streets of Denver City, their pace leisurely and comfortable, and gradually Jacob began to feel some of the tension leave his shoulders. "I've been thinking about our correspondence," Eleanor said as they walked, her voice thoughtful and measured. "In your letters, you wrote so beautifully about your life in the mountains, about the peace and solitude you found there. I wonder if perhaps meeting me has disrupted that peace in ways you hadn't anticipated." Jacob glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. She was looking straight ahead as she walked, her profile serene and composed, but he could sense the careful attention she was paying to his reaction. "I don't mean to pry," she continued, "but I couldn't help but notice that you seemed rather overwhelmed yesterday. If you've changed your mind about our arrangement, I want you to know that I would understand. The reality of marriage is quite different from the idea of it, and I wouldn't want either of us to enter into such a commitment unless we were both completely certain." Jacob stopped walking so abruptly that Eleanor had to turn back to face him. He stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, his hands clenched at his sides, struggling once again to find words for feelings that seemed too large and complex for language. Finally, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he managed to speak. "You're beautiful," he said, the words coming out in a rush as if they had been dammed up inside him and had finally found a way to break free. "I mean, I knew you would be lovely from your letters, from the way you write about the world, but seeing you, it's like looking at the sunrise over the mountains for the first time. It takes your breath away, makes you feel small and grateful and scared all at once." Eleanor's eyes widened at his words, and a soft blush colored her cheeks. "Mr. McKinnon, Jacob," he said, finding his voice growing stronger with each word. "Please call me Jacob, and I haven't changed my mind. If anything, meeting you has made me more certain than ever that I want you to be my wife. I don't know how to be around someone like you. I've been alone so long that I've forgotten how to talk to people, especially someone as refined and educated as you are." Eleanor smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made Jacob's heart skip a beat. "Jacob," she said, testing his name on her tongue, "I think you're selling yourself short. Your letters were some of the most eloquent and thoughtful I've ever received. You have a poet's soul, even if you don't realize it." They resumed walking, and as they did, Jacob found that the words began to come more easily. He told her about his journey from the mountains, about the cabin he had prepared for her, about his hopes and fears for their future together. Eleanor listened with the same attention she had brought to his letters, asking thoughtful questions and offering gentle observations that showed she was truly hearing what he was trying to say. By the time they returned to the boarding house, the sun was high overhead, and Jacob felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They had talked for hours, covering everything from practical matters, like the journey to his mountain home, to deeper questions about their expectations for marriage and the life they would build together. "There's something I need to tell you," Eleanor said as they stood on the front porch of the boarding house, her hand resting lightly on the railing. "Something I didn't mention in my letters because I wasn't sure how you would react." Jacob felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What is it?" Eleanor took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for his reaction. "I'm not entirely without means, as I led you to believe. When my parents died, they left me a small inheritance. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to ensure that I'm not coming to you as a burden. I wanted you to know that I'm choosing this life, choosing you, not because I have no other options, but because I believe we could be happy together." Jacob stared at her, processing this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I wanted to be sure that you wanted me for myself, not for what I could bring to the marriage. Too many men see a woman with money as a solution to their problems rather than as a partner in building a life together." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding her reasoning, even as he felt a new wave of inadequacy wash over him. "And now? Are you still sure about this? About me?" Eleanor stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "I'm sure," she said softly. "The question is, are you?" Jacob looked down into her violet eyes, seeing in them the same hope and uncertainty he felt in his own heart. "I'm sure," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They were married the next morning in a small ceremony at the local church, with Mrs. Henderson and the hotel clerk serving as witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had brought with her from Philadelphia, and Jacob had managed to find a barber who had tamed his wild hair and beard into something approaching respectability. The ceremony was simple and brief, but as they exchanged vows in the small wooden church, with the morning light streaming through the windows, Jacob felt as if he were participating in something sacred and transformative. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed his bride with a tenderness that surprised them both. Eleanor's lips were soft and warm beneath his, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the promise they had just made to each other. The journey back to Jacob's mountain home took 4 days, traveling slowly to accommodate Eleanor's lack of experience with frontier travel. Jacob had purchased a gentle mare for her to ride, a pretty chestnut with a calm disposition and an easy gait. Eleanor proved to be a quick learner, adapting to life on the trail with a resilience that impressed and delighted her new husband. They camped under the stars each night, Jacob teaching Eleanor how to cook over an open fire, and Eleanor sharing stories of her life in Philadelphia that painted pictures of a world Jacob had almost forgotten existed. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, away from the noise and bustle of civilization, Jacob watched his wife's face transform with wonder at the beauty of the wilderness around them. "It's so quiet," she said on their third night, as they sat by their campfire listening to the distant call of an owl. "I had no idea silence could be so complete." "Does it frighten you?" Jacob asked, remembering his own first nights alone in the mountains, when the silence had seemed like a living thing, pressing in on him from all sides. Eleanor considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "It's peaceful, like being in a cathedral, but one made by God instead of man." Jacob smiled at her words, recognizing in them the same sense of reverence that had first drawn him to these mountains. Perhaps, he thought, She would understand this life better than he had dared to hope. On the fourth day, they crested the final ridge, and Jacob's Valley spread out below them, like a green jewel set among the granite peaks. The cabin sat in a clearing, beside a stream that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Smoke rising from the chimney, where Jacob had banked the fire before leaving for Denver City. It was home, but seeing it through Eleanor's eyes, Jacob suddenly worried that it would seem crude and primitive to someone accustomed to the comforts of city life. "Oh, Jacob," Eleanor breathed, her voice filled with something that sounded like awe. "It's beautiful. It's like something from a fairy tale." Jacob felt a surge of pride and relief at her words. "It's not much," he said, "but it's ours now." Eleanor turned to him with tears shining in her eyes. "It's perfect," she said. "It's exactly what I hoped for." As they rode down into the valley, Jacob felt a sense of completion that he had never experienced before. The solitary life he had built in these mountains had been fulfilling in its way, but now, with Eleanor beside him, it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. The silence that had once been his only companion would now be filled with her laughter, her voice, her presence. The cabin that had sheltered only one would now be a home for two. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set behind the peaks, Eleanor reached for Jacob's hand. Her fingers were small and soft in his calloused palm, but her grip was firm and sure. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing me home." Jacob squeezed her hand gently, understanding exactly what she meant. This place, this life, this love they were building together, it was home in the truest sense of the word. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Jacob McKinnon knew that he would never be alone again. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery for both of them. Eleanor threw herself into the task of making the cabin truly their own, adding touches of beauty and comfort that Jacob had never thought to include. She planted the garden she had dreamed of, filling it with vegetables and herbs and flowers that brought color and life to the clearing around their home. She learned to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter, to mend clothes and make soap, to do all the countless tasks that frontier life demanded. Jacob, for his part, found himself seeing his mountain world through new eyes. Eleanor's wonder at the changing seasons, her delight in the wildlife that visited their clearing, her appreciation for the stark beauty of the high country, all of these things reminded him why he had fallen in love with this place in the first place. He began to share with her the secrets of the mountains, teaching her to read the signs that predicted weather changes, showing her the hidden valleys where the wildflowers bloomed in profusion, introducing her to the rhythms of the wilderness that had governed his life for so many years. Their love grew slowly and steadily, like the trees that surrounded their cabin, putting down deep roots and reaching toward the light. They learned each other's habits and preferences, their strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and fears. Jacob discovered that Eleanor had a quick wit and a gentle sense of humor that could make him laugh even on the darkest days. Eleanor found that beneath Jacob's rough exterior lay a man of surprising sensitivity and depth, someone who could find poetry in the flight of an eagle or the sound of wind through the pines. As winter approached, they worked together to prepare for the long months of isolation ahead. They cut and stacked wood, preserved food, and made sure their cabin was tight and warm against the coming cold. But this winter would be different from all the others Jacob had endured alone. This winter, he would have Eleanor's company, her warmth, her love to sustain him through the dark months. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their windows and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, Jacob gave Eleanor a gift he had been working on in secret for weeks. It was a rocking chair, crafted from the finest wood he could find and polished to a warm glow. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she ran her hands over the smooth armrests and the carefully carved back. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why?" Jacob took her hands in his heart pounding with nervous excitement. "Because," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought you might need it come summer." Eleanor stared at him for a moment, not understanding. And then her eyes widened as the meaning of his words sank in. "Jacob, are you saying—" "I'm saying that our family is going to grow," he said, his face breaking into a grin that threatened to split his cheeks. "You're going to be a mother, Eleanor. We're going to have a baby." Eleanor threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at the same time. "How did you know before I did?" "I've been watching you," Jacob said, holding her close. "The way you've been feeling in the mornings, the way you've been so tired lately. I've seen enough pregnant animals to recognize the signs." They held each other in the warm glow of the firelight, two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. But inside their cabin, all was warmth and love and the promise of new life. When spring came again to the mountains, it brought with it a daughter, a tiny, perfect creature, with Eleanor's violet eyes and Jacob's stubborn chin. They named her Hope, because that was what she represented. Hope for the future, hope for their family, hope for all the dreams they had yet to fulfill. As Jacob held his daughter for the first time, looking down into her small, serious face, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the loneliness of his solitary existence to the overwhelming beauty of meeting Eleanor, from the fear that he was not worthy of such love to the joy of building a life together. It had been a path filled with unexpected turns and miraculous discoveries. The mountain man, who had once paid a sack of grain for a bride, had received in return something far more valuable than he had ever dared to imagine. He had found love, true and lasting, and in finding it, he had found himself. The silence of the mountains would never again be empty, for it would always be filled with the voices of the people he loved most in the world. And as he sat on the porch of his cabin, watching Eleanor rock their daughter in the chair he had made with his own hands, Jacob McKinnon knew that he was the richest man in all the territory, wealthy beyond measure in the things that truly mattered. The peaks that surrounded their valley stood as eternal witnesses to their love, and the stream that ran past their door would carry the story of their happiness down through the generations, a testament to the power of hope and the miracle of finding one's true home in another person's heart.